Hey everybody, Brian here, and welcome back to North Africa. In a previous lesson, we briefly mentioned the countries of North Africa, but today we're going to go in depth with all 5, or kinda sorta 6. But don't worry, I'll explain. Our objectives today will be to identify the modern countries of North Africa, discuss governmental and economic systems of these countries, and investigate the complicated nature of conflict, both past and present, in the North African region. The 5 official countries of North Africa are Egypt, Libya, Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. Now, I mentioned a 6th, which is the disputed country of Western Sahara. This region is partially controlled by the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic. However, no UN member has recognized the country of Western Sahara to date, and most of the area is controlled by Morocco. So we already have a little insight into the last word of our lesson title, conflict. In order to understand the complicated relationships between these countries, let's talk about each in a little more detail as we discuss their governments and economies. Before we dig in, make sure that you have your PDF lesson guide printed because I've got your first question. Looking at this region, have you heard of any conflicts, challenges, or troubles for this area, perhaps in the news? Pause here and jot down a couple of ideas on number 1 in your lesson guide. By far the most well-known of the North African countries, ancient Egypt is considered a cradle of civilization, back to 3150 BCE, when a pharaoh named Mene united Upper and Lower, or North and South Egypt, into a kingdom. Egypt was under the control of many different groups until 1952, when it won control from the British, who had controlled the country since the end of World War I. Egypt instituted the Republic of Egypt in 1953. Now, when we call a government a republic, usually it means things like free elections, term limits, freedoms of speech, press, assembly, and others, right? Egypt's republic for much of its history has been anything but a republic. While occasional reforms have been made, Egypt's leaders have still functioned much like the pharaohs of old, with one man in charge, backed by a powerful military. Of the 3 presidents of Egypt until 2011, 2 of them were accused of rigging elections, limiting the press, and detaining and torturing thousands of people who disagreed with them. The other was actually assassinated for signing a peace treaty with Israel. That was the status quo until 2011, when an event occurred which rocked North Africa, and which we'll talk about in just a bit. The Egyptian economy revolves around 2 very important features: its popular location as a tourist resort, and the Suez Canal. About 88% of travel to Egypt is for leisure or tourism. The sector employs 1.7 million Egyptians and is responsible for about $21 billion in revenue annually. The Suez Canal, which runs between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, allows for ocean vessels to completely bypass Africa. Shipping tolls alone from this canal provide $5 billion to the Egyptian economy every year. Head over to your lesson guide and I want you to jot down a couple of things that you didn't previously know about Egypt. Pause the video here and answer under number 2.
Libya's history begins with the Amazigh people moving into the area at least 5,000 years ago. Mirroring the occupations of its eastern neighbor Egypt, Libya's location on the Mediterranean made it the target of many conquerors over the years.
In 1951, Libya declared its independence. Eventually, the country came under the control of Muammar Gaddafi. Gaddafi ruled as sole leader, with the backing of a strong military and a governing council until 2011, when that event I haven't talked about yet happened. Don't worry, it's coming. Libya's leadership, development, and economy are all tied to oil. Libya has the largest proven oil reserves in Africa, and its sale accounts for over half of the country's GDP, and 97% of its exports. With this money, Libya modernized its roads, schools, infrastructure, hospitals, and housing, and also held to a conservative version of Islam. Any economy tied to one product, specifically oil, can have severe ups and downs with the price of that product, and Libya is no exception. Most of its infrastructure had fallen apart by 2011, and unemployment rose as people weren't needed. At the same time, Libya imports almost 90% of its food and had to go into increasing debt to continue to buy. Let's pause here for a critical thinking question. From all the countries that you've learned about, including Libya, does it generally seem that having abundant natural resources is overall a positive or a negative thing for a country? Why or why not? Take a minute and answer under number 3 on your lesson guide. At over 919,000 square miles, Algeria is the largest country in Africa and the 10th largest nation in the world by area. Looking at the map, you can probably guess that it may not be all that heavily populated, and you'd be right. Most people live on the coast, where the climate is Mediterranean and far more temperate. While you may not guess by looking at it, this area has seen many conquerors over the last few thousand years, primarily because its proximity to the Mediterranean makes it ideal for trade and commerce. Algeria became a French possession after a bloody conquest which stretched from 1830 to 1875. Unlike other colonial areas, French citizens flocked to Algeria and through the early 20th century made up almost 1/5 of the total population. After independence in 1962, multiple presidents and conflicts with neighbors led to decades of instability. This culminated in a civil war between strict Islamist groups and more moderate government forces, which lasted from 1991 to 2002. This civil war was characterized by brutal massacres of civilian populations and was somewhat quelled by blanket pardons to all people participating, given by President Abdelaziz Bouteflika. Other than Egypt, the only other large space of arable land in North Africa is within its northernmost country, Tunisia. Home of the great ancient city of Carthage, known for the leader Hannibal and his early challenge of Rome for control of the Mediterranean, Tunisia also passed through periods of both European and Southwest Asian dominance before becoming independent from France in 1956. While officially a republic, Tunisia has a history of dominance by one political party. It was called one of the most modern but repressive countries in the Arab world by the Guardian newspaper, and in 2008 was ranked 143rd out of 173 for press freedom by Amnesty International. The economy was liberalized or allowed foreign investment and trade relations. But when you have only one group in power who doesn't answer to anyone, you tend to have corruption, which flourished in Tunisia until 2011. I hear you ask, what happened in 2011? And I get it. The suspense is killing you. We're almost there, but first, let's talk about Morocco.
Morocco is the possible origin of the Amazigh people, who, as we have seen, eventually inhabit most of North Africa. Morocco went through the typical dominance chain and won independence in 1956 after multiple armed revolts against colonial rule.
Morocco is a hybrid government in that it had a monarch but also an elected parliament, though until 2014 the king had almost complete authority. Some reforms have been attempted over the years, but only came to fruition after 2011. I know, I'm just baiting you now, aren't I? Since 1993, Morocco's economy has been open to competition and privatization, which have allowed for extensive mining operations. However, as with most of North Africa, more than half of the GDP comes from services directly related to tourism. Now, before I finally reveal what all the anticipation has been building towards, I want you to briefly pause the video here and fill in the anticipation guide under number 5 on your lesson guide. Alright, we're finally here. As a reminder, we have 5 countries with somewhat repressive regimes which have ruled for most of North Africa's independence era from Europe. In 2011, something changed, and it's finally time to discuss the Arab Spring. On the morning of December 17, 2010, 26-year-old Mohamed Bouazizi walked into the middle of a souk, or marketplace in northern Tunis, and set himself on fire. Bouazizi was protesting the taking of his wares for sale and harassment by Tunisian police. He died on January 4th, and the funeral procession was attended by well over 5,000 people, chanting that he would be avenged. From December and through his funeral, tens of thousands of Tunisians had taken to the streets, demanding changes. The Tunisian government fell January 14, 2011. Tunisia's protest success led to a swell of protests all across North Africa, which eventually led to the downfall of Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi and Egyptian dictator Hosni Mubarak. These massive protests across North Africa and the Arab world, later termed the Arab Spring, were historic in their scope and that such grassroots uprisings had never been seen in this part of the world before. So protests brought down leaders and clamored for change, but what actually occurred? And why have I been teasing you with it since the beginning of the lesson? In Egypt, the Arab Spring took on a huge scope, with the historic Tahrir or Martyr Square as the center of the action. After Mubarak's resignation and imprisonment for the killing of protesters, the country elected Mohamed Morsi in 2012. But he was overthrown in a military coup in 2013. Libya's protests turned into a years-long military conflict, and even after the ouster of the previous regime, Libya remains in a state of military and humanitarian crisis. Tunisia is the real success story. As of today, it is the only North African country classified as free by Freedom House. It is now the only truly democratic country in the Arab world by many rankings, and scores very high in both the Human Development Index and GDP per capita, which is over $10,000, top 10 on the African continent. Amazingly for this part of the world, as of 2020, a full 30% of the elected legislature were women, and in 2021, Najla Bouden was appointed Prime Minister. Take a closer look at this momentous event and the consequences in the Extend Yourself activity after the lesson. The story of North Africa is the story of conflict, but within that story, the push for freedom. From independence in the 1950s to the voices of Tunisia and Tahrir Square, which captured the world's attention, these countries remind us why we keep exploring. Hey, hey.